June 15, 1944, off the coast of Saipan, the sun rose at 6 a.m. over a horizon cluttered with the steel-gray hulls of the American Fifth Fleet. This was the opening of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, an engagement that would soon be immortalized by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By 4 p.m. that afternoon, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a potent carrier-based force. Hundreds of aircraft were spiraling into the Pacific, and with them, the last hopes of a conventional victory for the Empire of Japan. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of inevitable defeat that the traditional rules of warfare began to dissolve, replaced by a dark, clinical obsession with a singular concept: the guided weapon. But Japan did not have the microchips or the radar homing technology of the future. They had something more plentiful and, in their eyes, more reliable. They had the human soul. In the quiet offices of the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, a young ensign named Mitsuo Ota began sketching a design that would haunt the memories of every sailor in the United States Navy. Ota was not a career engineer, but a transport pilot who saw the writing on the wall. He envisioned a glider, sleek and small, packed with over a ton of high explosives, powered by 3 rocket motors, and piloted by a man who had no intention of returning. He called it the Oka, or cherry blossom. To the Japanese leadership, the name evoked the fleeting, beautiful life of a samurai falling at the height of its bloom. To the Americans who would soon face it, it would be known by a much more visceral name: the Baka bomb. Baka was the Japanese word for fool, but there was nothing foolish about the lethality of the design. By August 1944, the proposal reached the highest echelons of the Navy. There was initial resistance from some, who felt that sacrificing pilots in such a manner was a betrayal of the very people the empire sought to protect. But as the American island-hopping campaign moved closer to the Japanese home islands, morality was sacrificed on the altar of necessity. The MXY-7 Ohka was not merely a weapon. It was a symptom of a nation in its death throes. It was designed to be carried into battle under the belly of a twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. The plan was deceptively simple. The bomber would fly within 20 miles of the American fleet, release the Ohka, and the pilot would ignite his rocket engines, accelerating to speeds of over 600 miles per hour. At that velocity, no anti-aircraft gun in the world could track him. He would become a human lightning bolt, a living torpedo that could choose its target with the precision of a surgeon. The technical development moved at a feverish pace. On September 15, 1944, at 10 a.m., the first prototype was ready for inspection. The Ohka was a masterpiece of desperate engineering, built largely of wood and non-critical materials because Japan's metal reserves were nearly exhausted. Inside the cramped cockpit, there were no parachutes, no landing gear, and only the most basic flight instruments. The men selected for this task, the Jinrai Butai or Thunder God's Corps, were often the youngest, many still in their teens. Fueled by a mixture of intense indoctrination and a genuine desire to save their families from the impending invasion, they were told their deaths would be the spark that ignited a divine wind to blow the invaders back across the sea. As the first units were formed at the of 1944, the reality of the Ohka began to settle into the psyche of the Japanese military. It represented a terrifying leap in the evolution of warfare, the moment when the line between man and machine was intentionally erased. The Ohka was the ultimate realization of a total war philosophy, where the individual was no longer a combatant, but a component. This was the birth of a weapon born of pure desperation, a rocket powered by the dying embers of an empire that had run out of planes, run out of fuel, and eventually run out of time. The legacy of the Ohka is not found in its tactical success, which remained limited by the vulnerability of its carrier aircraft, but in the profound chilling effect it had on the human spirit. It serves as a haunting reminder of what happens when a society decides that its most valuable resource is not the lives of its youth, but the spectacular nature of their sacrifice. In the silence of the Yokosuka hangars, the cherry blossom waited, a beautiful name for a terrible purpose, marking the exact point where a civilization chose to embrace the darkness rather than face the dawn of its defeat. It remains a testament to a moment in history where the scream of a rocket motor was the only voice left for a nation that had lost its way. Late August 1944, at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, the blueprints for a nightmare were finalized under a veil of absolute secrecy. The engineers were not building a weapon to be used by a pilot, but a weapon that would incorporate a pilot as its most vital, expendable component. The technical design of the MXY-7 Ohka was a brutal study in efficiency, a 15-foot-long projectile that discarded the traditional requirements of aviation. Its fuselage was built primarily of aluminum, but in a desperate bid to conserve strategic materials, the wings and tail were crafted from humble wood. This was a craft intended to fly only once, and for a duration that could be measured in heartbeats. The heart of this machine was its nose, which housed a massive 200-kilogram warhead. To put that into perspective, this single charge of trinitroanisole was nearly twice the size of the bombs carried by standard Japanese dive bombers. It was designed with a specific, terrifying purpose: to punch through the thick steel belts of an American aircraft carrier and detonate deep within the hull, where the resulting pressure wave would tear the ship apart from the inside out. The weight of this explosive accounted for over half the total mass of the Ohka, turning the entire vehicle into a literal flying anvil of destruction. At 2 p.m. on a typical testing day, the roar of the static test stands would drown out the cicadas of the Japanese summer as engineers pushed the propulsion systems to their limits. At the rear of this wooden and metal coffin sat 3 Type 4 Mark I Model 20 solid-fuel rockets. These were not designed for sustained flight. Each rocket provided a massive burst of thrust that lasted only 8 to 10 seconds. The strategy was for the pilot to glide toward his target after being released from a mothership, and then, at the critical moment, ignite the rockets to achieve a terminal velocity that no anti-aircraft gunner could track. At full throttle, the Ohka could reach speeds of nearly 600 miles per hour in a dive. At that velocity, the wood and aluminum frame would groan under the atmospheric pressure, vibrating with a high-pitched scream that heralded the of everything it touched. The cockpit of the Ohka was perhaps the most haunting space ever designed by an aeronautical engineer. It was devoid of the complexities of a modern fighter. There was no radio for communication, no heater for the freezing altitudes of the upper atmosphere, and no parachute for the man inside. The instrument panel was a skeleton of necessity: an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, a compass, and a simple pull handle to ignite the rocket motors. For the young men strapped into that seat, the world was reduced to those few dials and the crosshairs etched onto the glass. They were the guidance system that technology of the era could not yet provide. They were the biological sensors tasked with navigating through a wall of fire and steel. Carrying this 4,700-pound burden to the battlefield was the task of the Mitsubishi G4 M2E Model 24J, a modified version of the Betty bomber. The Ohka was slung underneath the bomber's belly, its weight so immense that it stripped the mothership of its maneuverability and speed. This created a tragic paradox in the engineering of the cherry blossom. To be effective, the Ohka needed to be released within 20 miles of the enemy fleet, but the Betty bombers, burdened by their lethal cargo, were easy prey for American Hellcats long before they reached the drop zone. The very weapon designed to save the Empire was often the anchor that dragged its carriers to the bottom of the ocean before a single rocket could be fired. When we look at the cold, hard mathematics of the Ohka's design, we see a nation that had retreated into a logic of pure destruction. The 1,200-kilogram warhead and the rocket propulsion were triumphs of specialized engineering, but they were directed toward a dead. In the quiet of a museum today, the Ohka looks like a toy, small and almost graceful with its rounded nose and stubby wings. But its legacy is one of absolute darkness. It represents the moment when the human mind was forced to become a mechanical gear, when the warmth of a life was traded for the kinetic energy of a falling stone. It is a reminder that when technology is divorced from humanity, even the most brilliant engineering serves only to build a more efficient tomb. The cherry blossom did not bring a new spring to Japan. It was the final, frozen petal of a winter that the world must never forget. October 1, 1944, at Konoike Air Base in Ibaraki Prefecture, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, manufactured solemnity as the Imperial Japanese Navy officially commissioned the 721st Naval Air Group. This was the birth of the Jinrai Butai, or the Thunder God's Corps, a unit whose primary purpose was not to engage in dogfights or return from sorties, but to guide the Ohka rocket to its final, explosive destination. The men gathered on the tarmac were largely young, their faces etched with a mixture of terrifying resolve and the innocence of students-soldiers pulled from universities across the empire. They were the chosen few who would pilot the divine wind, and the psychological architecture required to prepare them for such a task was as complex as the machines they were destined to fly. The recruitment process was framed as a voluntary appeal, yet it existed within a societal pressure cooker where the concept of refusal was virtually non-existent. Commander Mitsuo Okamura, the unit's leader, sought men who possessed not just pilot skills, but an unwavering spiritual purity. When the call for volunteers went out, pilots were often given slips of paper with 3 options. I strongly desire to volunteer, I desire to volunteer, or I do not volunteer. To choose the third was to face social ostracization and the label of a coward in a culture that now viewed death as the ultimate expression of loyalty. By 3 p.m. on the day of the first major briefing, hundreds had stepped forward, many signing their names in their own blood to prove their sincerity. These were the Thunder Gods, and from that moment on, they were treated as living deities, separated from the rest of the military and given better rations and living quarters to mark their transition from mortal men to spiritual weapons. Psychological preparation began with the dismantling of the individual ego. The pilots were immersed in a rigorous schedule of spiritual training known as Seishin Kyoku, where the teachings of Bushido were distilled into a single lethal command to die beautifully for the emperor. They were told that their lives were as light as a feather, but their duty was as heavy as a mountain. To reinforce this, the training at Konoike was grueling, because the Oka was a rocket-powered glider with no landing gear. Pilots practiced in the MXY-7K1, an unpowered trainer. They were towed to high altitudes and released, forced to master the steep, high-speed dive that would become their final sensation of flight. There was no room for error, and the psychological strain was immense. They weren't just learning to fly, they were learning to fall with precision. As the months passed, the ritualization of their imping deaths became a central part of their daily existence. Pilots often spent their evenings writing final letters to their families, letters that were censored to ensure they reflected the proper spirit of sacrifice. They would cut locks of their hair and clip their fingernails, placing them in small wooden boxes to be sent home for burial in lieu of a body. By 9 p.m. most nights, the barracks were silent, filled with young men contemplating the void. They were taught to visualize the moment of impact, to imagine the flash of light and the total erasure of self as a moment of supreme enlightenment. This was the psychological armor they wore to deflect the natural human instinct for survival. The training intensified as the American fleet drew closer. The pilots were briefed on the technicalities of the Ohka, but the focus remained on the spiritual. They were told that once they were bolted into the cockpit of the rocket beneath the belly of a Betty bomber, they were already dead. The world outside the canopy was no longer their concern. The sensory experience of the training was designed to habituate them to this claustrophobia. The smell of oil, the cramped space of the cockpit, and the terrifying silence of the glider's descent became their entire reality. They were no longer pilots in the traditional sense. They were the human nervous system of a cruise missile, a biological guidance system that had been convinced that its own destruction was the highest form of success. The legacy of the Jinrai Butai is not one of military triumph, but of a profound and tragic waste of human potential. These young men, many of whom were poets, scientists, and students, were the victims of a regime that chose to weaponize the very virtues of loyalty and courage. The Thunder Gods did not change the course of the war, but they left behind a haunting reminder of how easily the human spirit can be distorted by the machinery of total war. Their story remains a testament to the chilling efficiency of a state that decides its children are more valuable as fuel than as a future. In the recruitment of the Oka pilots was the ultimate admission of failure, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between industrial reality and spiritual fantasy with the lives of the innocent. It stands as a somber warning that when a nation begins to see its youth as expendable components in a weapon of war, it has already lost its soul long before the final battle is ever fought. March 21, 1945. Off the coast of Kyushu, the first operational flight of the Jinrai Butai, or Divine Thunder Corps, prepared to unleash a weapon the world had never seen. This was the debut of the Oka, but it was a premiere defined by slaughter rather than success. 18 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, known as Bettys, took to the sky, each laboring under the weight of a piloted rocket bomb slung beneath its belly. The Japanese command hoped to surprise the American fleet, but their heavy, slow-moving bombers were spotted by radar long before they could reach their launch zones. Dozens of American Hellcats dashed on the formation like wolves. Because the Bettys were overloaded and unable to maneuver, they were sitting ducks. Within 20 minutes, every single bomber and its Oka payload had been sent into the sea. Not a single pilot had the chance to ignite his rockets. It was a devastating realization for the Japanese High Command. The ultimate weapon was useless if its delivery vehicle could not survive the approach. The tactics shifted as the battle for Okinawa intensified in the following weeks. The Japanese began launching the Oka from higher altitudes and using clouds for concealment, waiting for the moments when American air cover was thinned or distracted. April 12, 1945, near Radar Picket Station number 14, the crew of the USS Manat El Abail found themselves at the center of this terrifying new reality. The Abail was a powerful Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, positioned nearly 80 miles north of Okinawa to provide early warning against incoming air raids. At 1:45 p.m., the ship came under a frenzied attack by conventional Kamikaze aircraft. The gunners worked frantically, filling the sky with black puffs of flak and tracing lines of fire with their 20mm cannons. They successfully downed several planes, but the intensity of the engagement was merely a distraction for the nightmare hovering miles above them. High in the overcast sky, a Betty bomber maneuvered into position. Inside the cramped, cold cockpit of the Oka, a young pilot prepared for his final moments. He checked his simple altimeter and his primitive iron sights. When the bomber pilot pulled the release lever, the Oka dropped like a stone, tumbling for a second before the pilot stabilized the glide. Then he fired the 3 solid-fuel rocket motors. On the deck of the Abail, the transition from a standard air attack to an Oka strike was marked by a terrifying change in acoustics. A high-pitched, screaming roar filled the air as the silver shape accelerated to over 500 miles per hour. At 2:46 p.m., the lookouts spotted the missile, but there was no time to react. The Oka was moving so fast that the ship's gun directors could not track it. It was a blur of metal and human will that bypassed the wall of lead. The sailors tried to throw up. The impact was a physical shock that seemed to lift the entire 2,200-ton destroyer out of the water. The Ohka struck the starboard side of the Abail, penetrating the hull and exploding in the aft engine room. The 1,200-pound warhead, designed specifically to shatter the armored skin of warships, tore the ship's spine apart. The explosion was so powerful that the midsection of the destroyer essentially disintegrated. Even as the crew struggled to comprehend the blow, a second conventional kamikaze hit the ship near the forward fire room. The Abel began to fold in half like a piece of paper. At 2:50 p.m., less than 5 minutes after the Oka had appeared as a speck on the horizon, the Manat El Abel disappeared beneath the waves. 79 American sailors went down with her, victims of a weapon that combined the precision of a human brain with the unstoppable kinetic energy of a rocket. This engagement proved that when the Oka could be successfully launched, it was virtually impossible to stop. It was the first time in history a ship had been sunk by a manned-guided missile, a grim milestone that signaled a shift in the nature of naval warfare. Yet the sinking of the Abele did not change the trajectory of the war. For every Oka that found its mark, dozens more were lost as their carrier planes were picked off by American fighters. The weapon was a symptom of a military that had run out of options and turned to the macabre marriage of high technology and human sacrifice. The legacy of the Oka and the fate of the Manat El Abele serve as a haunting testament to the extremes of the Pacific theater. It remains a story of two different kinds of courage meeting in a catastrophic instant. On one side, the sailors who stood their ground against a weapon they could barely see, and on the other, the young men inside the rockets, convinced that their deaths were the only thing standing between their homeland and total annihilation. The Oka was a mechanical scream of defiance, a weapon born of a philosophy that viewed life as a secondary concern to the aesthetic of a beautiful death. It reminds us that in the final stages of total war, the boundary between a soldier and the ammunition he carries begins to dissolve, leaving behind only the cold, hard logic of the machine and the tragic silence of the deep. April 1, 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, the United States Navy faced a nightmare that defied every conventional rule of naval engagement. As the first reports of a small, incredibly fast aircraft streaking toward the fleet reached command, intelligence officers struggled to categorize what they were seeing. They soon realized these were not standard kamikazes, but purpose-built piloted missiles designed to overwhelm the senses and the defenses of even the most seasoned sailors. The Americans quickly dubbed the weapon the Baka bomb, using the Japanese word for fool or idiot. This name was intended to mock the perceived desperation of the tactic, yet it served as a thin veil for the genuine fear that rippled through the Pacific Fleet. The Oka was a weapon that required a different kind of war, and the Allies were forced to adapt their entire defensive doctrine in a matter of weeks. To combat this high-speed threat, the Navy transformed its defensive posture. The most critical and dangerous component of this defense was the radar picket line. This was a ring of destroyers and smaller support vessels stationed far ahead of the main task force, often 60 or 70 miles out. These ships acted as the fleet's early warning system, scanning the horizon for the heavy Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers that carried the Oka beneath their fuselages like a parasitic twin. By 9 a.m., on any given day during the height of the Okinawan campaign, the sky was already thick with the smoke of anti-aircraft fire as these picket ships fought for their lives. The duty was perilous because being a picket meant being the first target the Japanese pilots encountered. If an Oka was released, the picket ship was the most likely victim of its supersonic wrath. The Americans understood that the Oka's greatest weakness was not the rocket itself, but its delivery system. The Betty bomber was a relic of an earlier era of the war, notorious for its lack of armor and its tendency to catch fire under the slightest provocation. When weighed down by a 4,000-pound rocket, the Betty became even slower and less maneuverable, a lumbering target for the combat air patrol. U.S. Navy Hellcats and Corsairs were vectored toward these incoming groups long before they could reach the designated launch point. By 1:45 p.m. during one of the largest raids, American pilots reported seeing the Japanese motherships jettisoning their human bombs into the empty ocean just to regain enough speed to attempt an escape. If the carrier aircraft could be intercepted 20 or 30 miles out, the Oka was effectively neutralized, forced to sink into the sea alongside its dying crew. Despite the terrifying speed of the rocket once released, The program was a staggering tactical failure. The logic of the weapon required a level of coordination that the decimated Japanese air arms simply could not maintain by the spring of 1945. By 3 p.m., on many of these mission days, dozens of elite pilots and scarce air crews had been sacrificed for the sake of a few near misses or the sinking of a single destroyer like the USS Manat El Abele. The industrial and human cost was unsustainable, yet the Japanese High Command continued to push for more production, blinded by an ideological pursuit of a decisive blow that would never come. The Oka was supposed to be the divine wind made manifest in steel, but in reality, it was a weapon of diminishing returns that consumed the very men it was meant to avenge. The legacy of the Oka is not found in its military success, for it achieved remarkably little in the grand scheme of the conflict. Instead, it remains a haunting testament to the psychological extremes of total war. It represents a moment where technology was stripped of its life-saving potential and harnessed exclusively for the purpose of a ritualistic, high-speed death. When we look back at the wreckage of these machines today, we see more than just a failed experiment in aeronautics. We see the final, gasping breath of an empire that had run out of fuel, run out of planes, and ultimately run out of respect for the lives of its own children. The Baka bomb stands as a warning that when a nation begins to value the symbolic beauty of sacrifice over the preservation of its future, it has already lost the war, regardless of how fast its missiles might fly. It reminds us that the ultimate tragedy of the Pacific was not just the destruction of ships and cities, but the cold, calculated engineering of human despair into a weapon of war, leaving a scar on history that no amount of time can fully erase. August 15, 1945, at the Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu, a profound and eerie silence replaced the roar of rocket engines and the frantic shouting of ground crews. As the Emperor's voice crackled over the radio at 12 p.m. that day, announcing the end of the war, the men of the Jinrai Butai, the Thunder God's Corps, found themselves in a world that no longer required their deaths. For months, they had lived in the shadow of the Oka, a weapon that was less a machine and more a wooden coffin with wings. In the decades that have followed, the Oka has evolved from a terrifying spectacle of the Pacific War into a haunting artifact of what happens when a civilization's technical ingenuity is consumed by a cult of national suicide. To look at an Oka today, resting in the sterile environment of a museum, is to gaze into the abyss of human fanaticism. It is a sleek, almost beautiful object, its lines reflecting a mastery of aerodynamics and rocketry that was ahead of its time. Yet, its beauty is a lie. This was a weapon designed to solve a technical problem, the inaccuracy of early missiles, by using the most sophisticated computer then in existence, the human brain. But this computer required the destruction of the hardware. The tragedy of the Oka is not just in its failure as a tactical weapon, but in the terrifying logic that birthed it. It was the ultimate expression of a regime that had run out of steel and oil, and decided that the only remaining resource was the blood of its youth. We often focus on the mechanics of the rocket or the tonnage of the ships it targeted, but the true legacy of the Oka is found in the letters left behind by the pilots. These were not mindless zealots or brainwashed soldiers. Many were university students, lovers of classical music and literature, who understood with chilling clarity that their lives were being spent in a gamble that was already lost. They were told their deaths would be like falling cherry blossoms, beautiful and brief, yet the reality was a terrifying plunge into a wall of anti-aircraft fire at 600 miles per hour. The Oka stands as a monument to the perversion of the human spirit, where the noble concept of sacrifice was twisted into a requirement for the survival of a failing ideology. As we reflect on this era, the Oka serves as a grim precursor to the age of guided munitions. It was in many ways the first smart bomb, yet it was powered by a desperate primitive urge to seek victory through annihilation. It reminds us that technology is never neutral. When paired with a disregard for human life, even the most advanced engineering becomes an instrument of barbarism. The American sailors who dubbed it the Baka bomb or fool bomb, were not just mocking their enemy. They were expressing a fundamental disbelief that any nation would choose to exp its greatest treasure, its people, in such a wasteful manner. At 4 p.m. on many of those final days of conflict, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, young men sat in those cramped cockpits, waiting for a signal that would turn them into icons of a lost cause. The echoes of the divine wind still resonate today, whispering a warning from the hangars and coastal caves where these rockets once waited. They warn us of the danger that arises when a nation begins to value the symbolic glory of a heroic death over the difficult, unglamorous work of building a future. The Oka was a weapon born of desperation, a frantic attempt to stop the inevitable by turning men into machines. But history shows us that while machines can be perfected, the human soul cannot be so easily discarded. The Oka did not save the empire. It did not turn the tide of the war. It only added to the ledger of grief that defined the Pacific conflict. As the remaining pilots returned to a broken Japan, they carried with them the heavy burden of being the survivors of a suicide squad. Their legacy is not one of military triumph, but a plea for a world where no young person is ever again asked to be the guidance system for a bomb. The silent Okas in our museums are not just relics of a bygone war. They are mirrors held up to humanity, asking us what we value more, the power of our weapons or the sanctity of the lives they are meant to protect. The answer to that question determines whether we have truly learned the lessons of the Pacific, or if we are simply waiting for the next divine wind to blow us toward the edge of the world.